I never imagined that a single moment in a quiet afternoon would unravel the truth about my family, my son, and the woman I once trusted with my whole heart. Even now, years later, my hands still tremble when I think about that day. Before I continue, let me tell you this. Everything you're about to hear is real, and it changed my life forever. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 68 years old, and for the past 4 years, I have lived alone in a modest house at the edge of town. My husband passed away long before all of this happened, and my only son Daniel was my entire world. Losing him shattered me in ways I didn't know were possible. But what hurt even more than his death was discovering how deeply I had been lied to. Daniel was 34 when he died. A successful civil engineer, kind-hearted, gentle, and always worried more about others than himself. He married Laura 5 years before his death. Everyone admired her. Elegant, soft-spoken, always perfectly dressed, always smiling at the right moments. People used to say how lucky my son was, and I believed them. I truly did. When Laura told us she was pregnant, Daniel was over the moon. He called me every morning just to tell me how excited he was. He painted the nursery himself. He assembled the crib late into the night, refusing help because he said, "This is my job as a father." I watched my son glow with happiness, never suspecting that darkness was quietly growing behind the scenes. Their daughter Lily was born on a rainy evening in March. I still remember holding her for the first time. Tiny fingers wrapped around mine, eyes half open, peaceful. I knitted her a pale blue blanket with little white stars stitched into the corners. Daniel loved it. He said it made Lily sleep instantly. He joked that it was grandma magic. 2 years later, Daniel died. Laura called me that night, hysterical, barely able to speak. She said Daniel had slipped down the basement stairs. Severe head injury. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. I remember screaming in the hospital corridor, my knees giving out beneath me. I remember Laura holding me, crying into my shoulder, telling me over and over that she was sorry, that Daniel loved me, that we would get through this together. But we didn't. After the funeral, Laura changed. Slowly at first, then completely. She stopped bringing Lily to see me regularly. She always had excuses: work, Lily was sick, they were busy, she needed space. I tried not to push. I didn't want to be the overbearing mother-in-law. I was afraid that if I said the wrong thing, she might cut me off entirely. 3 years passed like that. I saw my granddaughter only on holidays and birthdays. Each visit felt shorter than the last. Laura watched me closely whenever I held Lily, as if she was afraid I might notice something I shouldn't. And then came the afternoon that changed everything. I had stopped by Laura's house unannounced to drop off a gift for Lily. I didn't plan to go inside. I just wanted to leave it by the door. But as I parked across the street, I saw Laura walking toward the trash bins behind the house. She was dragging a large black garbage bag, clearly annoyed, as if she wanted to be done with it quickly. That's when I saw it. A corner of a pale blue blanket slipped out of the bag. My heart skipped a beat. I recognized it instantly. The little white stars. The familiar stitching. The blanket I had made with my own hands. The one Daniel adored. Before I could think, Laura lifted the lid of the bin and shoved the bag inside, pushing it down forcefully, almost angrily, then slammed the lid shut and walked away without looking back. I sat frozen in my car. Why would she throw that away? Why would she discard something so meaningful, something that belonged to Lily, and to Daniel? The moment Laura disappeared into the house, I got out of my car. My hands were shaking as I lifted the bin lid. I dug through the trash bags until I found it. The blanket was dirty, wrinkled, and smelled faintly of perfume, but it was still there. I clutched it to my chest and drove straight home. That night, as I spread the blanket on my bed, I noticed something strange. Right in the center, beneath the soft fabric, there was a hard shape sewn between the layers. Something that definitely did not belong there. And that was the moment I realized, this blanket wasn't just a blanket anymore. It was hiding a secret that would expose a lie so big, it would destroy everything I thought I knew about my son's death. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's smile and that strange, unnatural bulge hidden inside the blanket. At dawn, I sat at the kitchen table with a pair of small scissors, my hands trembling so badly I had to stop twice just to steady my breathing. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that grief does terrible things to a mother's mind, but deep down I knew this was different. When I finally cut a careful seam along the inside lining, my breath caught in my throat. Tucked between the layers of fabric was a small sealed plastic envelope, yellowed slightly with age, and inside it were folded papers, documents crisp and deliberate. Not something that could have been sewn in by accident. I recognized Daniel's handwriting instantly. The neat block letters, the precise way he dotted his I's. My heart pounded as I unfolded the first page. It was a personal letter addressed to me. Mom, if you're reading this, something has gone very wrong. I had to stop reading then, pressing the paper to my chest as tears spilled freely down my face. When I gathered the strength to continue, the words cut deeper than any blade. Daniel wrote that he feared for his safety, that Laura had been pressuring him relentlessly about money, insurance policies, and ownership of the house. He said arguments had escalated, that she had threatened to leave him and take Lily if he didn't comply. He described feeling watched, monitored, controlled. Then came the line that made my stomach turn cold. If anything happens to me, please don't believe it was an accident. Beneath the letter were copies of bank statements, showing withdrawals I had never known about, and a partial insurance document with Daniel listed as the sole policyholder, one that Laura had later told me didn't exist. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped everything. Memories I had buried suddenly resurfaced with horrifying clarity. Daniel's bruised wrist he claimed came from work, the exhaustion in his eyes during our last phone call, the way Laura answered his phone more often than he did. I remembered how quickly she had insisted on cremation, how she discouraged an autopsy, how she had taken control of everything before I even understood what was happening. The room felt too small, the air too thick. I realized then that Laura hadn't just thrown away a blanket. She had tried to erase evidence. That blanket was never meant to be seen again. Never meant to reach my hands. And the most terrifying thought of all struck me like a thunderclap. Daniel must have hidden it there himself, knowing it was the one place she would never think to check, trusting that someday somehow it would come back to me. I sat there for hours staring at those papers, understanding that my son had reached out to me from beyond the grave, not for comfort but for truth. I knew then that I could never confront Laura directly, not yet. I had to be careful. I had to be smart. She had already proven how far she was willing to go. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the kitchen in harsh daylight, I made a quiet vow to my son. I would not let his voice be silenced. I would protect Lily. And whatever the cost, I would uncover exactly what happened in that basement, even if it meant tearing my family apart to do it. I waited 3 days before doing anything with what I found, not because I lacked courage, but because I needed absolute clarity. Panic would only ruin everything Daniel had so carefully set in motion. During those days I played the role Laura expected from me. The broken mother, subdued, grateful for her support, blind to anything beyond my grief. When she called, I answered softly, letting my voice tremble just enough to reassure her that I was harmless. She even visited once, standing in my living room with false concern in her eyes, her gaze briefly flicking toward the blanket folded neatly on the armchair. I noticed it and so did she. Her jaw tightened for half a second before she smiled again. That moment alone told me more than any document ever could. After she left, I finally made my move, not against her directly but toward the truth. I contacted an old friend of Daniel's, Marcus, a man I barely knew but instinctively trusted because Daniel had mentioned him often in happier times. I didn't reveal everything at first. I simply asked if Daniel had ever seemed afraid. There was a long silence on the line before Marcus exhaled sharply and said, "I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that." That was when the dam broke. Marcus told me Daniel had confided in him weeks before his death, admitting that Laura had changed, becoming controlling, obsessed with finances, angry when Daniel refused to sign new paperwork. Marcus said Daniel once joked, "If I end up dead, tell my mom to check the house." It hadn't sounded like a joke then, and it sounded even less like one now. Encouraged, I reached out to Daniel's former co-worker, Elise, who confirmed that Daniel had asked about modifying his life insurance beneficiary shortly before he died, but never completed the change. Laura, it seemed, had rushed to finalize everything immediately after his death. Piece by piece, the story sharpened into something undeniable. Still, evidence meant nothing without action. So I went to the one place Laura believed I would never dare step into, the basement of Daniel's house. I told her I wanted to collect Lily's old toys for charity, and she waved me off with barely disguised irritation, confident that she had already erased anything that could hurt her. The basement smelled the same as always. Dust, oil, damp concrete, but something felt different now, heavier, as if the walls themselves knew what I was looking for. I noticed scuff marks near the stairs, scratches I had dismissed before as wear and tear. Behind an old shelving unit I found it. A loose panel in the drywall, hastily repaired, the paint slightly mismatched. My heart hammered as I pulled it away, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside was Daniel's old phone, wrapped carefully in plastic. My hands shook as I turned it on. The battery still worked. What I found on that phone made my knees buckle. Voice recordings. Messages. Videos. Laura's voice, sharp and furious, accusing Daniel of ruining everything, threatening to make him regret it if he didn't cooperate. One recording ended abruptly with Daniel saying, "Laura, stop please," followed by a loud crash and silence. I sank to the floor, sobbing, clutching the phone as if it were my son's hand reaching out to me. In that moment, grief transformed into something else, resolve. This was no longer about suspicion or fear. This was about justice. I backed everything up immediately, sending copies to myself, Marcus, and even a secure cloud account Daniel had apparently set up for this exact purpose. He had planned for this. He had known. As I left the basement, Laura stood at the top of the stairs, her arms crossed, eyes cold. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked casually. I met her gaze, steady and calm, a strength she clearly did not expect. "Not yet," I replied. Her lips curled into a thin smile, but I saw the flicker of unease beneath it. She sensed the shift. She knew something had changed. That night, as I sat alone in my car, I realized the most dangerous part of this journey was only beginning. Laura still believed she was in control, and that made her reckless. Daniel had passed the truth to me like a torch, and now it was burning in my hands. I wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. I was a witness, and soon she would realize that witnesses don't stay silent forever. The days that followed felt like walking through a minefield. Every step calculated, every word measured, because Laura had begun watching me more closely than ever before, her politeness thinning into something sharp and suspicious. She called twice a day now, asking innocent questions that carried hidden weight. Whether I was sleeping, whether I had spoken to anyone about Daniel, whether I planned to visit the house again. I answered carefully, maintaining the fragile image she preferred. A grieving, aging woman clinging to routine. Inside, however, I was preparing. I consulted a lawyer under the guise of updating my own will, never once mentioning Laura by name, but instead asking hypothetical questions about contested estates, suspicious deaths, and delayed evidence. The lawyer's raised eyebrow told me everything I needed to know. "If you have proof," he said quietly, "timing is everything." Timing. Daniel had understood that too. I revisited the recordings repeatedly, listening not just to Laura's threats but to the fear in my son's voice, the pauses where he seemed to weigh whether speaking was worth the risk. One video showed his hands shaking as he hid the phone behind the wall, whispering, "If you're hearing this, it means I was right." That sentence haunted me. Meanwhile, Laura's behavior began to crack under the pressure of her own lies. She showed up unannounced one afternoon with groceries I hadn't asked for, scanning my living room as if searching for something misplaced. When her eyes lingered on my laptop, my heart skipped, but I forced myself to smile and offer tea. She declined, pacing instead, talking too fast about bills, about Lily's school, about how stressful everything had been for her. Then she stopped abruptly and said, "You don't think Daniel would hide things from me, do you?" The question hung between us like smoke. I looked at her, really looked, at the tightness around her eyes, the clenched jaw, the desperation bleeding through her composure, and I realized she was afraid. Afraid that Daniel had outsmarted her even in death. "Daniel trusted people who earned it," I said evenly. "He was careful." Her face hardened for a fraction of a second before she laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. That night, Marcus called me with urgency in his voice. He had spoken to someone at Daniel's old workplace, someone who remembered Laura storming into the office weeks before Daniel died, demanding access to financial documents she had no right to see. Security had escorted her out. That incident had never been reported. brushed aside as a family matter. I documented everything, compiling timelines, saving messages, organizing files the way Daniel used to, methodical, precise, undeniable. But the real turning point came when Laura made a mistake born of arrogance. She invited me to Lily's birthday dinner, insisting it would mean the world to the child if I attended. I knew it was a trap, a stage where Laura could assert control and gauge my reactions, but I went anyway. The house was full of people, laughter echoing against walls that had witnessed too much pain. As Laura moved through the room playing the perfect hostess, I noticed something new on her wrist, a thin silver bracelet. My breath caught. I had seen that bracelet before, wrapped inside a cloth in Daniel's desk drawer, engraved with a date and initials that were not hers. Daniel had told me once it was meant for Lily, a gift he planned to give her when she turned 18. Laura caught me staring and instinctively covered her wrist, her smile faltering. "Daniel gave it to me," she said quickly, too quickly. In that moment, something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not violently, but decisively. After dinner, I pulled Laura aside and told her I needed to speak to her privately. We stood in the hallway, the noise fading behind us, and I leaned in just enough for my voice to stay low. "You shouldn't wear things that don't belong to you," I said. Her pupils dilated. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "I'm talking about Daniel," I replied. The color drained from her face. For the first time, she didn't pretend. Her hand trembled, her breath quickened, and she hissed, "You have no idea what you're doing." I straightened, meeting her gaze with calm certainty. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said. And so did he. We returned to the party, but the balance had shifted. Laura avoided me for the rest of the evening, her laughter forced, her movements stiff. As I drove home, I realized the truth had finally reached her. Not through accusations or police reports, but through fear. She knew now that Daniel had left a trail, and that I was following it step by step. The game was no longer about hiding evidence. It was about who would make the first irreversible move. And this time I was ready. After that night, everything moved faster, as if Laura sensed the ground slipping beneath her feet, and began scrambling for control in ways that only revealed her desperation. She stopped calling as often, but when she did, her tone had changed, sweeter, almost apologetic, layered with a false warmth that made my skin crawl. She spoke about family, about forgiveness, about how Daniel would have wanted peace, each word carefully chosen to test whether guilt still worked on me. I listened without reacting, letting her believe her performance was effective, while behind the scenes I pushed forward quietly. Marcus helped me connect with a private investigator, a man who specialized in financial abuse and domestic coercion, and when I played Daniel's recordings for him, he didn't interrupt once. He only nodded slowly, his expression hardening, and said, "Your son was documenting a pattern. This wasn't an accident." Those words settled into my bones with both relief and grief. The investigator uncovered things I never would have imagined, accounts Daniel had opened secretly, not to hide money, but to protect it from Laura's access. Emails Laura had deleted from shared devices. A witness from the hospital who remembered Laura insisting on signing paperwork while Daniel was still sedated, her voice sharp, impatient, almost angry that he wasn't waking up fast enough. Each discovery felt like another piece of a puzzle Daniel had started assembling long before he died, trusting that someone, me, would finish it if he couldn't. Meanwhile, Laura's behavior grew erratic. She showed up at my door late one evening, eyes red, claiming she was overwhelmed, that she felt alone, that she didn't know who to trust anymore. I let her inside, offered water, and watched as she scanned the room again, searching for signs of what I knew. She cried, real tears this time, telling me she loved Daniel, that people misunderstood her, that stress had made her say things she didn't mean. I didn't comfort her. I didn't accuse her either. I simply listened, letting silence do the work words couldn't. When she realized I wasn't reacting, her tears stopped abruptly, as if someone had turned off a switch. She looked at me then with something close to hatred and said, "You're punishing me." I met her gaze calmly. "No," I replied. "I'm waiting." That seemed to unsettle her more than any accusation ever could. The following week, the investigator uncovered the final thread. An insurance policy Laura had quietly increased just months before Daniel's death, listing herself as the sole beneficiary, justified under vague claims of future security. On its own, it might have meant nothing. Combined with the threats, the financial manipulation, the witness statements, and Daniel's recordings, it meant everything. I took the file to the lawyer, who reviewed it carefully before leaning back in his chair and saying, "This is enough to reopen questions that were never properly asked." The words sent a chill through me, not fear but resolve. Still I hesitated. Not for Laura's sake but for Lily's. I thought about her small hands clutching balloons at her birthday, her innocent laughter echoing through a house built on lies. Exposing Laura would fracture that world completely. But then I remembered Daniel's voice in the recording, steady despite the fear. "If something happens to me, don't let her rewrite the story." That was the moment I understood. This wasn't revenge, it was preservation. Laura had already rewritten everything else. I refused to let her rewrite him. When Laura sensed the shift, she lashed out. She sent messages accusing me of poisoning Lily against her, threatening to cut off contact entirely, hinting darkly that legal action could get ugly. I saved every word. Her fear had turned into aggression, and aggression into recklessness. One night she sent a text meant for someone else, just a few words but enough. "He told her too much. I can feel it." That message, forwarded immediately to the investigator, became the crack that shattered everything. Authorities were contacted, not dramatically, not publicly, but formally, with evidence laid out in careful order, just as Daniel would have wanted. When Laura was questioned, she denied everything at first, confident, composed, the grieving widow again. But confidence erodes under scrutiny. Her timelines didn't align. Her explanations contradicted the records. Her calm gave way to irritation, then anger, then silence. Watching it unfold felt surreal, like standing outside my own life, observing someone else's tragedy. I didn't feel triumph. I felt heavy. Vindication carries weight, and justice, when it finally arrives, is quieter than people expect. As proceedings began, Laura stopped contacting me altogether. The house grew quiet again, but this time it wasn't empty, it was resolved. I sat alone one evening, listening to Daniel's last recording one final time, and whispered into the stillness, "I'm here. I finished it." The road ahead was still uncertain, still painful, but the truth was no longer buried. Laura could no longer control the narrative. And for the first time since Daniel's funeral, I slept without the feeling that something was clawing at my chest, waiting to be heard. The legal process did not explode into the world the way movies make it seem. Instead, it crept forward quietly, methodically, with paperwork, interviews, and long stretches of waiting that tested my patience and my strength. Laura was not arrested immediately, nor was she publicly accused at first, and that silence became its own kind of torment. People still spoke of her with sympathy, still described her as the poor widow, still brought casseroles to her door while I sat alone with the knowledge that the truth was finally moving, inch by inch, toward the surface. Investigators revisited the hospital records, this time with sharper eyes, asking questions that had never been asked before, replaying moments that had been waved away as stress or grief. Nurses began remembering details they hadn't thought mattered. Laura refusing to leave Daniel's side even when asked, Laura correcting him when he tried to answer questions, Laura insisting on medication changes with an authority that felt rehearsed. One nurse admitted she had felt uneasy but hadn't wanted to accuse a grieving wife without proof. Now finally proof existed. Meanwhile, Laura's mask slipped further. She hired an attorney known for aggressive defense tactics, and suddenly her story hardened into something cold and strategic. She stopped crying and started blaming. Blaming doctors, blaming stress, blaming Daniel himself for being fragile and paranoid. Hearing those words relayed to me felt like a second loss, sharper than the first, because they stripped away any lingering illusion that love had ever truly existed between them. Through it all, Lily remained the silent center of every decision. Social services became involved, gently at first, then more formally, assessing what Laura's instability might mean for a child who had already lost her father. I was interviewed repeatedly, asked about my relationship with Lily, about my home, my health, my willingness to step in if needed. Each question felt like a test I hadn't studied for, but I answered honestly without embellishment or resentment. I spoke about bedtime stories, scraped knees, the way Lily clung to my sleeve when she was tired. I spoke about Daniel's hopes for her, his belief that she deserved gentleness and safety above all else. Those interviews drained me, yet they also gave me purpose. For the first time since Daniel's death, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was participating. Laura, sensing control slipping away, attempted one final maneuver. She reached out through a mutual acquaintance, proposing a private resolution, hinting that if I withdrew my statements, she would ensure I never lacked access to Lily again. The message made my hands shake, not from temptation but from disgust. She still believed everything could be negotiated, traded, silenced. I declined without response and forwarded the message to the investigator. That was the moment I later learned that prosecutors decided to move forward more decisively. The narrative Laura had built began to collapse under its own weight. Financial experts testified about the insurance changes. Digital analysts confirmed the deleted emails and message tampering. Daniel's recordings, once private whispers of fear, became evidence. His voice steady, measured, heartbreakingly clear. Listening to them played aloud in a sterile room felt like watching him die again, but this time he wasn't ignored. This time people listened. Public awareness followed slowly, then all at once. A short article appeared online, careful with its wording but unmistakable in implication. Comments poured in, some supportive, some cruel, some accusing everyone involved of lying for attention. I learned quickly that truth, once released, does not travel alone. It brings noise, judgment, and chaos with it. Through that storm, I focused on Lily. When she came to stay with me temporarily during evaluations, she asked simple, devastating questions. Why Mommy cried so much, why Daddy wasn't coming back, why adults whispered when she entered a room. I answered with care, choosing honesty softened by age-appropriate language, promising her only what I could keep, that she was loved, that she was safe, that none of this was her fault. At night, after she fell asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, I sat awake wondering how many scars she would carry from things she was too young to understand. Laura was eventually restricted from unsupervised contact, pending further review, and the shift in power was unmistakable. The woman who once commanded every room now sat across tables answering questions she couldn't spin her way out of. When I saw her briefly in a hallway during one hearing, she looked smaller somehow, her confidence replaced by something brittle and hollow. Our eyes met for a second and I expected anger, but what I saw was fear, not of punishment but of exposure. That was when I realized her greatest terror had never been prison or loss. It had been being seen for who she truly was. As the process continued, exhaustion set in, deep and bone-heavy, yet beneath it ran a current of quiet determination. Daniel's story was no longer trapped in recordings and memories. It was documented, acknowledged, impossible to erase. Whatever the final outcome, that alone mattered. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. I was protecting a legacy, a child, and my own sanity. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, one truth stood firm at last. The silence that had once protected Laura was gone, and it would never return. By the time the case reached its most critical phase, I had learned that justice is rarely dramatic. It unfolds in quiet rooms, measured voices, and decisions that reshape lives without fanfare. The hearings became more frequent, more intense, and with each one, Laura's carefully constructed image eroded further. Witnesses who once hesitated now spoke with clarity, no longer afraid of being wrong or alone. A former colleague described Laura's fixation on control, how she demanded admiration and reacted coldly when it wasn't given. A family friend recalled unsettling remarks Laura had made about being trapped by motherhood and how Daniel owed her for the life she believed she deserved. None of these statements alone would have mattered much, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Through it all, I sat quietly, hands folded, listening to strangers dissect the life my son had lived and the marriage he had tried so desperately to survive. It was painful, humiliating even, but it was also necessary. Daniel was no longer being reduced to a headline or a statistic. He was being recognized as a man who had tried to speak up and had finally been heard. Lily's situation moved on a separate but equally heavy track. Psychologists evaluated her emotional state, her attachment patterns, the subtle ways stress had already shaped her young mind. Their conclusions were gentle but firm. She needed stability, predictability, and caregivers who prioritized her emotional safety over appearances. When they recommended that Lily remain with me for the foreseeable future, I felt a rush of relief so powerful it brought tears to my eyes, followed immediately by fear. Loving a child is one thing. Becoming responsible for healing wounds you did not cause is another. Laura reacted to these developments with fury masked as victimhood. She wept loudly in court, spoke of betrayal, accused everyone of conspiring against her, yet her words rang hollow now. The judge listened patiently but no longer indulgently. Boundaries were set, restrictions formalized, and for the first time, consequences became real. Outside the courtroom, public opinion shifted as more information emerged. Sympathy drained away, replaced by unease and anger. People who once defended her fell silent or distanced themselves entirely. I learned not to read comments or articles anymore. Validation from strangers had no power to soothe what only time could heal. At home, life took on a new rhythm. Lily began school near my house, tentative at first, then slowly blossoming. She laughed more freely, slept more soundly, and asked fewer frightened questions at night. We built small rituals together. Saturday pancakes, evening walks, story time before bed. That grounded both of us. Sometimes she spoke about her mother with confusion rather than anger, and I allowed space for that. I never spoke ill of Laura to her. I simply told Lily that some adults make choices that hurt others, and that it's okay to love someone, while also being protected from them. Those conversations were among the hardest I have ever had, but they were also the most honest. Meanwhile, the case against Laura reached its conclusion. The final ruling did not feel like victory. It felt like closure edged with sorrow. Laura was held accountable for her actions. Not in a way that erased the past, but in a way that acknowledged harm and set limits on future damage. When the judgment was read, the room was silent. Laura stared straight ahead, her face unreadable. And I realized then that whatever punishment she faced externally would never equal the internal emptiness she carried. As we left the courthouse, there were no cheers, no dramatic gestures, only the quiet understanding that a chapter had ended. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding. Not just Lily's world but my own. I returned to hobbies I had abandoned, reconnected with friends I had neglected, and allowed myself to grieve Daniel properly, without rage clouding every memory. I visited his grave with Lily, telling her stories about her father that highlighted his kindness, his humor, his love for her. She listened carefully, as if storing each detail away like a treasure. Through her, Daniel lived on in a way that felt peaceful rather than painful. There were still difficult days, moments when fear crept in about the future, about whether I was strong enough to be what Lily needed long term. But each time doubt rose, I reminded myself that strength is not loud or fearless. It is steady, persistent, and rooted in love. Laura's presence in our lives diminished to a distant, supervised reality, no longer a looming threat but a cautionary shadow. And in that quieter space, something unexpected grew: hope. Not the naive hope I once had that everything would turn out fine on its own, but a grounded hope built on truth, accountability, and the courage to face reality head-on. I had lost a son, gained a responsibility I never anticipated, and discovered a resilience I didn't know I possessed. The story was no longer about what Laura had done, but about what Lily and I were building together, one honest day at a time. The future did not arrive all at once. It unfolded quietly, in ordinary moments that slowly stitched themselves into something resembling peace. Months passed, then a year. And with each season, Lily grew more confident in ways that felt almost miraculous. She stopped flinching at raised voices, stopped asking if she would have to move again, and began planning her life in small, hopeful increments. What she wanted to be for Halloween, which books she wanted to read next, whether we could plant strawberries in the backyard. Those simple questions told me more about her healing than any report ever could. Laura's presence faded into a distant formality, confined to supervised visits that felt more like obligations than connections. Lily approached them with caution but without fear, and when they ended, she returned home relieved, as if stepping back into a place where she could finally exhale. I learned then that safety is not just about protection from harm. It is about the freedom to be yourself without bracing for impact. In that space of safety, I began to heal too. For a long time, I had defined myself by loss, by being Daniel's mother, by surviving Laura's cruelty, by holding things together through sheer will. But slowly, I rediscovered parts of myself that existed before tragedy reshaped my life. I laughed again, not out of politeness but because joy genuinely surprised me. I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't dominated by court dates or fear. Grief never vanished. It softened, transforming from a sharp wound into a quiet companion that reminded me of love rather than pain. On the anniversary of Daniel's passing, Lily and I visited his favorite park. We brought flowers, sat on a bench, and shared memories without tears this time. Lily talked about how she felt him with her when she was brave, and I realized that his legacy lived not in what he suffered, but in the strength his daughter was learning to claim. The legal chapter closed fully when the final paperwork arrived, neat and impersonal, confirming what we had already begun to live. A stable, protected life built on truth. I placed the documents in a drawer and didn't look at them again. They no longer defined us. What defined us were mornings filled with sunlight, evenings spent reading together, and the quiet trust that had grown between a grandmother and a child who had both been forced to grow up faster than they should have. Sometimes people ask me if I'm angry at Laura, at the system, at the world for letting things go as far as they did. The truth is, anger had its season, and it served its purpose by pushing me to act when silence would have destroyed us. But holding on to it now would only steal space from the life Lily deserves. Accountability happened. Boundaries were drawn. That is enough. Forgiveness, I learned, does not mean excusing harm. It means refusing to let that harm dictate the rest of your story. Laura remains a part of Lily's history, but she no longer controls her present or her future. As for me, I have learned that love can be both fierce and gentle at the same time. It can stand up in court and then come home to bake cookies. It can demand justice and still offer compassion where it is safe to do so. I did not choose this path, but I choose every day to walk it with intention. Lily will grow, she will ask harder questions, she will form her own understanding of the past, and when she does, I will be there. Not to shape her answers but to support her as she finds them. That is what Daniel would have wanted. When I look at Lily now, I no longer see only what she survived. I see what she is becoming. Thoughtful, resilient, kind in a way that comes from deep understanding rather than innocence. And when she smiles at me, unguarded and bright, I know that something good has come from all this. Not because the pain was necessary, but because love refused to give up. This is not a story about revenge or triumph in the traditional sense. It is a story about choosing truth over silence, protection over appearances, and hope over fear. It is about how one message, one moment of realization, set in motion a chain of events that saved a child and transformed a life. If there is anything I have learned, it is this. It is never too late to stand up, never too late to act, and never too late to build something better from the ruins of what was lost. And that, finally, is where our story rests. Not in tragedy, but in the quiet, hard-won promise of tomorrow.